The tape recordings you are about to hear were recorded in undisclosed locations more than 20 years ago. They were made on an old microcassette recorder and have never been played publicly before. Some of the things that are said may be both difficult to understand due to the quality of the tapes and troubling to hear due to content. Listener discretion is advised. It's 2001. Dave Rupert has been undercover for nearly a decade, pretending to be a true believer in the Irish Republican cause. He's been passing along everything he does, everything he finds, to the FBI and MI5 with the goal of preventing terrorist attacks. But after a devastating bomb blast killed 31 civilians in Omagh in 1998, just as the Good Friday peace agreement was taking hold, authorities decided it was time to crack down. After all, the people had voted for peace. The Good Friday Agreement was ratified by an overwhelming majority, and in the eyes of the people, the violence should be done with. Just a few years later, this American mole has gotten himself enough intel to go after the man leading the most militant faction of the IRA, Mickey McKevitt.
He told me that they were about 20% responsible for all that, and the continuity was 80%. And he said that we stole the car, we built the bomb, and we gave it continuity. Even Mickey said it was just an operation or that. You know, Mickey never pointed his finger at BSS.
In the summer of 2000, the FBI and MI5 come to Dave with a proposition. They're going to pull him from the field. His operation is over. It's time to prosecute. Dave is the key witness. Dave says Mickey has even admitted to him that his real IRA was partly responsible for the Omagh bombing. But Dave was never supposed to testify. He told us his contract was just for gathering intelligence. With support from the U.S. and British, the Garda are going to arrest Mickey McKevitt, and the Irish government is going to ask Dave to testify in court, to publicly out himself as a spy, something that if he's not careful could cost him his life. You might remember what Michael Gallagher said about this situation.
If they had had even a clue that he was passing on information to anybody, he would have been dissected. His body would never have been found.
So, you know Dave. He wants money, and maybe rightfully so.
It had to do with we had to take care of ourselves here because the average Joe's perception of that was their liability. You know, the joke for us, I said, well, maybe I get a job as a greeter at Walmart. And they said, yeah, with if you wanted to, like, provide them with, a $50 million liability policy or something.
I'm Abden Pallasch.
I'm Bob Hergeth.
In partnership with Entropy Media.
This is Underbelly, the rebel kind.
The main evidence against Michael McKevitt was going to be David Rupert's evidence. So they were very concerned about his security.
It wasn't like he said, oh yeah, there's a confession here. It was just like, well, he's an unsavory character and we want to get some dirt.
How can you say that you're fighting for the people at the people don't want you to?
At Mickey's insistence, Dave spent the latter half of the year 2000 shopping for a vacation home near Dundalk. A town on Ireland's east coast just before the border with the north, Dundalk was Mickey's longtime home. He and his wife Bernadette had been raising children there for years, and it was friendly to IRA types. That is, until Omagh. After the bombing that killed 31 people in 1998, Mickey, Bernadette, and the real IRA were no longer looked upon kindly.
Following the Omagh bombing in August 1998, the Irish government brought in a whole series of new laws. And one of the laws was directing a terrorist organisation. And in fact, Michael McKevitt was the first person who was charged with that offence.
This is longtime special criminal court reporter Diarmaid McDermott. He covered the trial when it happened.
somebody decided that McKevitt had to be prosecuted, and the organization had to have its head chopped off. And they decided that the best person who could bring that about would be David Rupert.
Dave remembered a time when his wife Maureen was along for a double date with Mickey and Bernadette.
I think the only thing that shocked her was the night that Mickey and Bernadette and I were having dinner, and Bernadette was bitching about her kids getting treated at school not very well because of the incident. And I think it finally dawned on Maureen that the incident she was talking about was Omar. And she was just recording it to it as an incident.
Mickey wanted his American pal, an Army Council member, to get a home close by. Dave told us it was a documentary about Omar that changed his mind when it came to testifying. That and Maureen helped talk him into it. With the loss of so many innocent lives, he knew the real IRA had to be stopped. He agrees to testify, but with a few conditions.
There was two guys that were off the table, in my deal, and Frank was one of them. Frank was one of them, and there was a guy from Glendoran, a guy by the name of Declan Crenine, that I said that I wouldn't have. Frank is too old, and the guy, Declan Crenine, was just too stupid. He was a nice guy and real innocent. He gave me a ton of information, but he was just very simple.
He also stipulates that he wants to be in the British witness protection. He told us he doesn't trust the Garda and thinks the British will be better at hiding him from Irish terrorists than the U.S. So in January 2001, Dave is pulled from the field and gives a statement at a Garda station in Dublin.
When I went over to give my statement to the Irish back in January of last year, and when we get out of that, they said, well, can you take us up and show us these places? And, it's Reverend Park at night or the back, and, I live my way around pretty well, but, they weren't like, on the White House on the road, Yeah. And those things all look the same. Yeah. But I did find it, and I found the place we had to have council meetings and McKevitt's house.
Once again, in an instant, Dave's life changes forever. He's now in hiding.
We were on the move in January, but he didn't get arrested in April. And so when they arrested McKevitt, they had to arrest some other people too, so it didn't look like they were picking on McKevitt.
Mickey's wife Bernadette was arrested, but released and never charged. We spoke with her briefly this past summer outside her Dundalk home. She was critical of Dave. She portrayed him as sleazy and unreliable, but otherwise didn't want to comment.
Well, Bernadette, that's why they kind of left her alone, I think. But they let her go the next day. And then, she's the mother with kids over there, and that would be pretty sacred over there,
And in Massachusetts, police swoop in to arrest the alleged assassin Dave knew as James Smith. Months earlier, Dave had a scary last meeting with Smith. Dave had delivered weapons and bomb supplies to a hotel room for a rendezvous with James Smith. FBI agents were in the next room keeping track.
All they wound up doing was deporting her. And they had tapes from, I don't know what they had, because I was in that room when I took the stuff, and there was 9 FBI agents were next to her. And they let him go.
After McKevitt was arrested in Ireland, U.S. authorities arrest the man known as James Smith. But Dave says they simply deported him to Ireland, and he disappeared. Dave gave us several names associated with James Smith, but we've been unable to determine his true identity. When McKevitt is arrested, the verbal attacks come.
My dad and my brother be in duck truck. Or like canoe. That's what's in the They call it Tempe terrorism because the profile.
Dave is used to life on the edge. He's been a trucker, spending self-reliant days on the road. He's been in physical danger as a logger. He's had dinner with former hitmen and enforcers for dictators. So when it comes to 10p terrorism, as he calls it, Dave was unbothered. Dave's family is on board. They support Dave testifying in the name of justice for the people who were killed in Omagh and the families that were devastated.
Well, regardless, at the end of the day, to me, they're mass murders. And probably some of the stuff they do is just phenomenal. How can you say that you're fighting for the people that the people don't want you to?
Testifying was a long process. Mickey was arrested in April 2001, and the trial was held in 2003. Again, reporter Diarmaid McDermott.
The trial opened on a Wednesday in June 2003, and he was due to give his evidence on the following Monday. And he turned up amid very heavy security. He was surrounded by armed plainclothes detectives, members of the Special Detective Unit, as they're known, and they ushered him into the witness box. It's a very classic courthouse. It was built in 1798, and Dave Rupert came in. He was the first witness on the Monday morning. Obviously, we'd heard about his size and his girth, and in fact, court officials had been discussing, would he fit into the witness box? He's 6'7" and 20 stones.
Dave made constant trips to London and Dublin with a dedicated security team.
We sat over there for 2 weeks, and they had a chopper on crew and call for me.
He told us he was actually flown in the Queen's helicopter because it was the only one with a seat big enough to fit Dave. Dave was being protected by the British government, and he was flown over to Dublin to testify in Ireland's Special Criminal Court.
They were very worried because the main evidence against Michael McKevitt was going to be David Rupert's evidence. So obviously he was the key witness. Without his evidence, there would be no case to answer for McKevitt. So they were very concerned about his security. They were also concerned about how long he would be in the witness box, and they were concerned that no one should know where he was staying or any details like that.
When Dave decides to testify, it's bad news for Mickey. Dave doesn't have to provide evidence Mickey killed anyone or even that he was responsible for the Omagh carnage. He only has to provide evidence that Mickey directed and belonged to a terrorist group.
Proceeded to give his evidence against McKevitt, which was very damning evidence.
Dave has been by Mickey's side for more than a year, learning the ins and outs of his operation, and Dave's testimony is pretty powerful because he has a knack for remembering things as they happened.
They told me one time that, my report was so close to what was said on the wires. There was cars in the yard with almost the plate numbers. On top of everyone, I believe it. Just had a knack for that,
It becomes clear to McKevitt's attorneys they're going to have to dig pretty deep to find any evidence that Dave might not be as reliable as he actually is.
And they tried to portray him as a totally non-credible witness so that the 3 judges, would not give his evidence any credence.
Again, author Sean O'Driscoll.
One of McKevitt's barristers did making cases that in court to try and throw him and stuff like that, or McKevitt just staring him out. And
Dave's detractors really tried to smear his name in news stories and editorials. First, they accused him of having affairs, but Maureen had complete faith in Dave. Then they said he was a criminal with a history. Eventually, Mickey's attorneys got wind of Dave's book deal, another potential weak spot. Remember, we were his co-authors on a book. We'd been interviewing him for a couple of years. We'd even begun writing up a manuscript. Now, Mickey's lawyers want to know what he's been telling us. Maybe there are inconsistencies between what he's been saying for the book and what he's saying on the stand. Maybe they can make it look like Dave made it all up to get money on this book deal. Maybe he's embellishing his stories for cash.
McKevitt's attorneys want us to turn over all our notes and tapes of our interviews with Dave, hoping for some evidence that he is unreliable. It's something lawyers like to call a fishing expedition. They're casting a line hoping something will come back. So the FBI called and relayed the Irish attorney's request that we hand over our notes and tapes. This is a classic dilemma for journalists. When an authority or government wants you to provide information from a source, we typically decline these requests because we want to protect our sources. If they can't tell us things in confidence, why would they come to us? That's part of a concept called reporter's privilege. But then again, this was a murkier situation, because Dave wasn't just a source here, he was our co-author. We had already agreed to let the FBI review the manuscript for potentially damaging national security disclosures. We said no to turning over the tapes, relying on this concept of reporter's privilege. That's when my name came up on the federal court docket. The case will come to be known as McKevitt v. Pallasch.
I taught this case for years in a course that I used to teach at Northwestern called International Criminal Law in U.S. Courts, as part of the section on obtaining efforts to obtain evidence overseas between different sovereigns.
This is Juliet Sorensen, a law professor at Northwestern University in the Center for International Human Rights. She also serves as executive director of Injustice Watch.
Our international community does have multiple systems to try to accommodate instances in which evidence is located abroad. One of these systems, actually the oldest one, is the one where you found to your surprise that you were a named party to a case here in the United States, and that's called letters rogatory. So this came in the form of a letters rogatory request to the United States, and it came, as you know well, out of a trial in Ireland's Special Anti-Terrorist Court.
She says fishing expeditions like McKevitt's don't come along often.
I'm hesitant to apply a number to it. I will say that letters rogatory in general is regarded as old-fashioned and inefficient. So my guess is that you were perhaps the unwelcome members of a club that's pretty small.
So we had to get a lawyer.
When Abden first called me, the only two things I remembered was Levin asking why I hadn't bought a toothbrush and trying to talk Abden out of going to jail.
We spoke to our old attorney from back then to recap the case over the tapes.
I'm David Ernest Dunn. I've been practicing law since the 80s. For nearly 30 years, I've been representing media operations and reporters on all various media issues, from defamation and privacy defenses to opening public records and FOIA requests to fighting subpoenas on journalists. By now, I probably handled over 100 reported or decisions coast to coast or First Amendment and related type of issues.
And a sizable portion of his business is keeping Bob and Abden out of trouble.
Yeah, we spoke to him from his home in the country where he's semi-retired.
Did we help him pay for that?
Oh, definitely.
At some point during our conversation, you'd use a line about how reporters are your strangest clients.
Yes.
McKevitt's trial has already begun in Dublin, and Dave is on the stand. McKevitt's lawyers asked Dave if he would mind us turning over our tapes to them. Dave may not have wanted our candid conversations out in public, but he didn't want to seem like he was hiding something, so he says that's fine. And that kind of pulls the rug out from under our reporter's privilege claim. The district court rules against us, so we appealed that decision to a higher court. Enter Judge Richard Posner of the U.S. 7th Circuit Court of Appeals.
The problem with McKevitt, when I went back and looked at Posner's opinion, was he just sort of thought that Rupert wanted this tape to be used, which I don't think was the case. I looked at some of our stuff, and it didn't appear that any of the Irish prosecutors or judges were at all interested in this tape. And I think they kind of got confused and thought it was some kind of official request.
One of our problems was the timing.
My first thought was this had two bad things. One was terrorism, and the other is tapes, which are almost as bad as terrorism.
This was a case about terrorism in the post-9/11 world.
My guess is that that did play an influence, at least an unconscious influence, in the court's ultimate decision. I was an assistant U.S. attorney from 2003 to 2010. In the immediate aftermath of 9/11, the USA Patriot Act was in full force, and an effort to maximize information sharing between the authorities in the realm of terrorism was, I think, a high priority for Western governments.
Ordering us to turn over the tapes, the lower court had written, "As recent events have made clear, we have a substantial interest in investigating and prosecuting terrorism both here and abroad."
Right then, I knew it was a dangerous case because I knew what Posner was thinking, as well as some of those people on the Seventh Circuit, and I knew they were out of step with all the other circuits. And I was going to try and get this, if we could, sort of slip through under the carpet and just persuade this judge that it was really overreaching on the defense part, because we didn't really, he wasn't asking for anything specific in the tapes. It wasn't like he said, oh yeah, there's a confession here, or there's a witness here, or there's a document he references. It was just like, well, he's an unsavory character and we want to get some dirt.
Judge Richard Posner was a well-known jurist on the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals here in Chicago. His court denied our appeal to keep the tapes. That's when we decided to turn them over and end the appeal. To be honest, we didn't have a great case. Our source wasn't confidential, and our source is on record saying he didn't mind if we surrendered the tapes. So if we tried to push this further in the courts, we might end up with an opinion that would devastate reporters' privilege for future cases. That's what we were trying to prevent when we decided to turn over the tapes. We recently took a drive over to the Dirksen Federal Building, where the FBI offices used to be, to relive that 4th of July weekend in 2003.
On Thursday, the 3rd of July, that's when we have the court drama. And you and Flynn and I are standing there in the lobby of the Sun-Times debating what we're going to do. Are we going to keep pushing this? We're going back. We're waiting for the verdict. We want to be there in court. We're reporters. We want to be there where it's happening. And our lawyers say, no, you're not going to go into court, because when you're in court, it's more easy to compel compliance and they can put you in prison there or whatever. So they say, we do not want you in the courtroom while this is going on. And it's that morning, we filed our appeal overnight. Mm-hmm. Or no, first thing in the morning. We drafted it overnight. They file it first thing in the morning. We go into our court case where we're supposed to hand over the tapes, and instead our lawyers go in there and say, we've just filed an appeal with the Seventh Circuit, and the lawyers for McKevitt say, okay, we want you to put them in jail. We want you to start leveling fines. And the magistrate judge, Ian Levin, says, no, let's just wait and see what the Seventh Circuit does before we decide on that. But McKevitt's lawyers are quite upset that we did not comply with the order of the judge from the previous day. This is on Thursday. Now, a couple hours later, the order comes down from the Seventh Circuit saying denied. An explanation will be forthcoming. It is unsigned. We don't know, was it one judge? Was it a panel of judges? We don't know which ones. All we know is that the Seventh Circuit is not going to take our case. So now the question is, do we try to appeal it to the U.S. Supreme Court, or do something else? Right. And our lawyers tell us no. Right now, with the speed with which they reacted means that if we push this to a full hearing, we're going to lose, and you'll be setting a bad precedent that will come back to haunt journalists in this situation. Right now, it's just one court case in a U.S. District Court. It doesn't have the power of precedent, so if you shut it down now and just hand over the tapes, it won't be so bad. So we took their advice, and we decided we would hand over the tapes. Our lawyers went back into the court. They said we would hand over the tapes. And so this is the 3rd of July. We don't have the tapes with us. They are in Dick Cheney-esque undisclosed locations.
The basement of my parents' bungalow.
It is revealed here for the first time.
Asbestos-filled basement.
Where they've been hidden. So that's where the tapes, we've had them stashed. So we have to go retrieve the tapes overnight, so we can't turn them in that day. So they say, okay, the next morning, which is the 4th of July, everything's closed for the holiday. So we come down here to the Dirksen building.
Yep.
And we pull up.
And by the way, we're sitting right here where we were at the time. We're in the car and reenacting it here, sort of. Roll down the window.
Yeah, and we've called, as we're driving in, I think you call whichever agent was going to be working the holiday to take the tapes from us. So we pull up here. Downtown's deserted for the holiday. We pull up here, and we've called ahead to let them know we're coming. So the agent comes out. You're sitting in the passenger seat. What did he say to you?
We said, thanks, guys. No hard feelings. And we handed it over, and that was it.
Even though we complied, doing what we thought was right to prevent a bad precedent for journalists, Judge Richard Posner in the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals issues an opinion anyway. Reporter's privilege is the idea that a journalist can keep their sources anonymous or their sources' information confidential in the interest of providing a public service by sharing information. A landmark Supreme Court decision known as Brandsburg v. Hayes, which actually went against the reporters, nevertheless resulted in an opinion from one of the justices saying in part, there is a privilege which courts should recognize and apply on a case-by-case basis to protect confidential information. That note has been cited ever since as support for reporters' privilege.
The privilege belongs to the reporter, not to the source, under Illinois law. And doctrinally, that should be true. But as far as Posner was concerned, no. Once the source, I think he even emphasizes it in his opinion that, Rupert wanted it published and you guys didn't. So, he literally had Rupert been a confidential source, we might have even gotten Posner turned around on it. I think Posner was stewing about the treatment of Brandsburg for years and probably wanted to write something about it.
A few months after that 4th of July transaction, Judge Posner wrote an opinion.
He had been casting about for an opportunity to try to make his mark on the reporter's privilege. As you say, the issue had been mooted, and the Seventh Circuit could have just as easily declined to take the case at that point. But that didn't happen. And what a frustrating outcome, all the more so. I didn't even know that, actually, Abden, that the appeal had effectively been withdrawn.
I think he was offended from an aesthetic point of view that this gloss on Brandsburg even existed. And there was no real need for him to produce that opinion, which I think he sort of admits that there wasn't any real need to publish that. He said the appeal was moot when the tapes were produced. And he says there's something about, well, I said I was going to do it. And so in this unusual circumstance, I'm going to do it. There was no necessity for that at all. The people who asked for the relief didn't get the relief. So there's no reason the only reason to publish something would be to explain to us why you screwed us. A lot of it was his belief that reporters should be treated just like everybody else and shouldn't have this First Amendment gloss.
We also spoke to Jane Kirtley, a professor of media ethics and law at the University of Minnesota. She wrote a friend of the court brief on our behalf when she was president of the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press. She now teaches the McKevitt v. Pallasch decision to undergraduate and law school classes.
It is such an important ruling because it really sort of blew up the whole idea that we had all relied upon, that there really was a constitutional privilege. Posner just said, nope, there isn't. And that was very troubling. When you requested the federal district judge to enter a stay to stop the forced transfer of your recordings to Ireland, you requested that the Court of Appeals enter into this question as well and to grant the stay. They refused to do so, really without any opinion, but some months later, Judge Posner wrote the opinion that became known as your case. And I've taught this case many times to my students. And what I always say to them is that basically the judge said, I don't know what you all have been smoking, but there's nothing in Brandsburg that creates this qualified constitutional privilege. Didn't disagree with the approach that you chose to make about trying to protect unpublished information. I think that is something that journalists believe in their hearts they should be able to do.
Media companies across the country were shocked by the decision. Outlets like the New York Times, ABC, NBC, CBS jointly filed a friend of the court brief asking Posner's colleagues on the court to reconsider his ruling. But such is Posner's stature, they wouldn't do it. Everyone braces for other courts to adopt Posner's ruling. But thankfully, in the 20 years since, no one really has. We reached out to Posner while researching this podcast, but unfortunately, his health prevented him from speaking to us.
The Seventh Circuit, and I think one other circuit, are the only two federal courts of appeals that have not recognized the reporter's privilege.
Lawyers know when dealing with reporters, it's not going to be a normal outing in court. Just ask our attorney.
And there's never any economic rationale for what they want to do. You know, in your normal practice, you're trying to keep people out of trouble and save them money. And when you're dealing with reporters, it's the reverse. It's awfully hard to apply hindsight to getting calls from the FBI. I mean, you know, I only have one piece of advice when you get contacted by the FBI: call my lawyer and then shut up. You'd be amazed how hard people find that advice to follow. I don't think that there could have been anything to do because there was no ability to prepare the ground. The ground was prepared in Ireland without them even knowing. At that point, it's hard to actually take an action that won't make things worse. I literally sat in conferences where somebody says to the reporter, well, you know, you could be in Toronto by 6 o'clock tonight. And, you know, I think it's a credit to the profession that nobody ever takes that advice.
When Dave first agreed to testify, he wasn't sure what to expect, but he knew it was going to be a long process, something he tried to explain to the FBI, but he says they didn't get it.
Well, again, not fighting the FBI, but, you know, it's just like when we're going to go to prosecution, and it's a lot of the stuff I say, no, you don't understand you know, what it's like there. You know, when I said, you know, because I said it'll be 2 years before, you know, it goes to court. Oh, no, we've got the inside on this, you know, that we expect to go even like in October. We were hearing this in June, July. I said, no, where?
Dave was pulled from the field and gave a statement in January 2001. He would spend the next 3 years in and out of England and Ireland going through the court system.
And we were told that it was, you know, they expected it was going to go in October. And even some of the Irish, and I just said, there's no way. Oh, well, you know, basically, we've got inside information from them. I said, no, you don't understand. I said, they'll tell you that. They don't mean that, you know.
Dave said one of his contacts at the FBI finally leveled with him. They didn't know what to expect at all.
He said, I'm going to tell you something. He said, they didn't have a clue that, you know, any of the stuff that's happening was going to happen. And he says, it's all news to them, too. And they were all just dumbfounded by the shit that was going on in corporate. And with no slight to, you know, the FBI, you know, just the Irish, it's just different, you know, and with no slight to the Irish, because that's the way they are, you know. Wonderful. Just, you know, I'm just so sorry that, you know, we could never go back.
Dave endures weeks of brutal cross-examination from McKevitt's lawyers. Questions about his bankruptcies, his divorces, his youthful exploits. One thing that came from our tapes and made it into the court proceedings was that story Dave told us about his trucking partner giving a lift to underage girls. Bernadette McKevitt even brought up that story when I spoke to her. Nevertheless, the lawyers found nothing in our tapes that contradicted what Dave had been saying on the stand.
It's just extraordinary that when they did get the tapes, how little they varied. You know what I mean? I think it was a big disappointment because they were expecting Rupert to have contradicted himself all over the place from his direct evidence versus the tape, but he really didn't. You know, he might have criticized people, but he was pretty consistent about what happened. And that actually weakened their case, really.
He was indeed a star witness. Again, Diarmaid McDermott.
Well, he certainly gets a lot of credit for beheading the organization by leading to the imprisonment of Michael McKevitt, who was the main inspiration behind the BLIRA, the main guiding force behind it. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison when he was convicted of directing a terrorist organization. And in fact, he wasn't released until 2016 when he was suffering from cancer. But so he did serve a long, lengthy prison sentence, and that did effectively behead the organization. It meant that the organization, which had been made up of very experienced terrorist figures from the provisional IRA, it didn't have the same type, the same cachet, the same type of leadership that it would have had without David Rupert's help in bringing down Michael McKevitt.
Mickey McKevitt is convicted and sentenced to 20 years in prison for directing terrorism. Dave is finally free from his double life, but now he's looking over his shoulder.
You know, I keep pretty close tabs and all that stuff. It's something to get that, you know, there's a couple of chat boards there and stuff with my name showing, my address shows up. I want to know it, you know, before everybody else does, you know.
Our meetings with him were in secret locations, and he was always keeping an eye on the door. He spent years undercover. Like we said earlier, his family didn't even know what he was doing. Honestly, they kind of thought he'd gone off the deep end, so it was news to them that their big old little brother Joby was a secret agent. When Entropy Media got in touch with us 2 years ago, we weren't sure if we wanted to relive this. It was difficult work. We spent almost 3 years researching Dave's story and corroborating details from the tapes, only to have all that work taken out of our hands back then, not to mention dealing with the FBI. They seemed to try to purposely undercut our efforts to try and get our book published even before we got sucked into court. They said they might censor anything in our book that it might offend the British government and thus hurt U.S.-British relations, and therefore jeopardize national security. Dave believed U.S. or British authorities even tried to keep publishers from buying our book. It felt bad, but we dug out the tapes and got back to work. Partly because we both love Ireland. We have close connections. We've covered the country and its conflict for decades. And the island is at an interesting crossroads today, with many claiming that a united Ireland is indeed finally possible. That's next time on the final episode of Underbelly, The Rebel Kind.
If you liked this episode of The Rebel Kind, you could do us a favor by leaving a positive review on whatever hosting service you're listening to us on.
The Rebel Kind is created and hosted by Bob Hergeth and Abden Pallasch. Executive producer, Anjay Nagpal. Written by Dalton Main, Abden Pallasch, and Bob Hergeth. Senior producer, Dalton Main.
Editing and sound design by Gerard Bauer. Original music by Dale Eisinger. Show art by Rebecca Hendon.
Our show was recorded in the podcast studio at Roosevelt University. Our development producers were Danielle Elliott and Jen Swan.
Marketing support from Tessa Cairns Clay. Production legal by Bruns, Brennan, and Barry. Legal clearance fair use by Rachel Strom at Davis Wright Tremaine.
From Entropy Media, the Underbelly series was created by Anjay Nagpal. Executive producer, Josh Fjellstad. Executive producer, Gerard Bauer. Head of operations is Nuna Ebo. Project manager is Sebastian Perry. Associate producer, Heidi Rudvoets. Development and production support, Simona Kessler.
Special thanks to Flynn McRoberts for calling us in 20 years ago. This series is dedicated to the innocent victims of Northern Ireland's decades of violence.